Well, hello everyone. My name is Jean-Sébastien Rioux. I'll be hosting today's webinar. I'm the Scientific Director of International Policy and Trade at the School of Public Policy, University of Calgary. Thanks for joining us. The School of Public Policy is Canada's leading policy school known for our practical research and for bringing people together to discuss important issues with experts, which is what we're trying to do today. I'm pleased to welcome you to the second edition of a new series of webinars hosted by the School of Public Policy to provide expert commentary on issues that are impacting all of us on a daily basis. Recordings of the webinars can be found on on our YouTube channel, and you'll receive a link in the follow-up email. In today's webinar, we'll discuss the impact that COVID-19 is having on Canadian foreign policy and Canada-US trade. Our speaker today is Dr. Jean-Christophe Boucher, who is the Program Director for Security of State and Resources at the School of Public Policy, as well as an Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. He's also a Director of Research in Civil Military Relations at the Canadian Defence and Security Network, funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council. He's a Fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, a Research Fellow at the Centre for Study of Security and Development at Dalhousie University, and Senior Fellow at the Centre Universitaire de Recherche sur les Relations Internationales du Canada et du Québec. He holds a BA in History from the University of Ottawa, a Master's in Philosophy from the Université de Montréal, and a PhD in Political Science from Université Laval. He specializes in international relations with an emphasis on Canadian and defense policies, international security, and methodology. For our format today, Jean-Christophe will take about 7 minutes to give a briefing on the current issue, and then I'll engage him with a few questions before opening up to the audience Q&A portion. Please type your questions in the Q&A box below, and I will be moderating these with Jean-Christophe in about 12 or 15 minutes. And so I'd like to turn this presentation over to you, Jean-Christophe.
All right, can you hear me now? Yes, it works? All right. So welcome everyone. So I was asked to kind of start to think about like what are the consequences and the ramifications of like the COVID crisis on Canadian foreign policy. We haven't seen a lot of those yet. We haven't seen governments kind of reflecting on like what's next, what we should do. And this is a good opportunity for us to kind of think about like the global implication of COVID for Canadian foreign and trade policy. I was given 7 minutes to kind of make this long thing. I'm going to try to like keep it together and stay organized. And I think the first thing we have to think about is like what we saw before COVID. It's not at all clear that COVID will change everything and the international environment in which Canada like is facing. So thinking about what kind of environment we were dealing with before COVID kind of explains to us like where we should go and how like things will impact our foreign policy. And to put it optimistically, Canada was facing several challenges in terms of foreign policy. The international environment has not been kind the last couple of years, and to be honest, like Canada has been trying to find a voice in the international system and trying to hold on to what we had in the last 50 years. And there were certain kinds of things that were happening in the world at that time that are still there. First and foremost, of course, the decline of the United States, or at least a willingness in the United States to be a little bit less active in the world and have a smaller footprint, and to challenge the kind of assumptions that we took for granted for the last 50 years. I think most commentators agree that the Trump administration is more a symptom of US malaise, more so than actual the disease, that even if Trump would lose the election in the upcoming fall election, spring election, it's not all clear that things would change. So we see the United States being less willing to maintain the world, less willing to engage with partners and allies, and that has been difficult for Canada because much of our voice has been able to kind of piggyback on US importance, and that has been a problem for us. On trade issues, for example, we have been able to sign the USMCA and kind of put forward this. But in our relationship with the US has been difficult, which means that our reliance on that special relationship has now to be kind of taken with a grain of salt. The Americans will be more and more willing to put their interests in front of ours, and it's going to be more and more difficult to kind of convince them to play nice with their northern neighbor. Secondly, we've seen the rise of like challengers in the world, China and Russia, but also at the regional level with Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other countries who have been more and more willing to kind of play a bigger role in the world and kind of challenge the assumptions we had. Canada has been stuck between a rock and a hard place. In some cases with Russia, with China, with Saudi Arabia, like there has been willingness from these countries to push back on Canada, to kind of use Canada as a proxy to show that the United States have less influence in the world. And for us, that has been kind of difficult and a hard wake up call for us. So these challengers means that at the security level, it seems plausible that the world is less secure, that the odds of greater confrontation with these powers are increasing. And so we have seen the Canadian government to kind of like increase military spending and kind of like focusing on this. And that shouldn't change. The third part I would say is also the kind of hardening of democracies around the world, in Europe, but also in Eastern Europe, where less and less natural allies to Canada have been willing to kind of help Canada to maintain the international world order. And so we are finding ourselves with less, allies and friends around the table who like speak their minds the same kind of way that we think. And finally, the fourth one we have seen, and that kind of dwells into COVID, we have seen the international organizations trying to keep relevance in that world where, the challengers are kind of reconsidering their importance, and also the United States less willing to kind of bolster these organizations. And for Canada, that has been a problem. So as we're like, that was like a pre-COVID environment, and Canada has been trying to find its voice and a path in those waters. The federal government, the Liberal governments, kind of made the argument that we should bolster and keep up and participate in keeping a rule-based environment, which always served our purpose. It's not at all clear that there is a willingness amongst the Americans or the Chinese or the Russians or even like natural allies like the European countries to actually maintain this. And it seems like all these countries are more and more looking for toward their own interests and less in relying on international governance to increase cooperation. So and that has been a problem for Canada. We don't exactly know where this is going. There's the optimist part that said, or people that say like we will weather this environment and we'll get better. Others are saying like this is a significant change in international politics, and Canada has to find a way to be a little bit more self-reliant and essentially, finding an environment that is less sympathetic to Canadian ideals and values. COVID brings about and kind of exacerbates all these tensions, and although a lot of people will say like this is a game changer, the odds are that what we're going to see is essentially a strengthening of these different trends. We've seen Russia and China kind of willing to play on the COVID crisis to continue the kind of challenge that they've been doing. I think we're going to talk about this later on with Jean-Sébastien. The Americans have been more and more willing to play hard and to think about their own interests and pushing back against Canadians, but also against the world. There's like talks about how the Americans bought French face masks out of like on the tarmac of a airport, just basically trying to protect themselves. And and in the grand scheme of things, it seems like COVID has increased the tendency of countries to look inward, to limit international cooperation, and to more and more focus on trying to maintain this. And this will have a major impact on our foreign policy. On the one hand, as countries are closing down borders, there's going to be a hardening of immigration laws across the world, and countries will be less and less willing to promote the free movement of people that we've seen at least since the 1945. For an immigration country like Canada, that has become a problem, and we'll see an influx of migration coming back to Canada as like Europe and the US and other countries are closing down. On trade, we're seeing right now that trade relationships have been severed. There is now a willingness to bring bad production at the national level. That's going to disrupt completely our trade environment. It's going to be complicated for Canada to kind of make this happen. Most of our food source are from the US. Now with closing the borders and essentially that unwillingness to kind of promote the free trade of goods will mean that Canada will have to rely more and more on its own agricultural production for its food security. That means a massive transformation of what we're trying to do. And finally, I think I'm going to close it there. It's not at all clear that there is a willingness in the world right now to dwell with this, with international organization. There hasn't been this kind of conversation about like, this is a global pandemic. We have to promote an international cooperation. It seems like the crisis has increased the willingness of states to use this to protect themselves, and less so for Canada. So we will face greater challenge than what we had before, both in terms of trade, in terms of immigration, in terms of security, and I think the future for us post-COVID will be bleak and difficult, and we'll have to have a really interesting and mature conversation of what that foreign policy will look like, which, to be honest, most political parties right now have not been willing to do and to have. And we have revolted back on our default, either a pro-American approach or a pro-internationalist approach, and no middle path between those.
Wow. So thank you for that. I want to follow up with something you said about Europe and Eastern Europe, and countries retrenching, within themselves. Some countries seem to be using this pandemic to curtail their citizens' rights and maybe even secure their own political positions. I'm thinking about Hungary. We saw Mr. Putin could now be president until well into the 2030s. So do you see this? You do research on populism and on illiberal governance around the world. Is this a blip? Is this just Hungary and maybe a few others, or is this a trend?
That's a good question. I think it's a trend. Part of my research right now, part of the publications I'm doing right now is on populism and its impact on international politics, and whether or not populism or populist movements have an impact on how states behave in the international system. And what we've seen so far is that it really depends on the kind of populist government we're seeing. We've seen, for example, right-wing populist governments like Hungary challenging more and more the kind of free movement of people and pushing for anti-immigration and nativist policies, and closing down their borders. We've seen this, for example, in the UK, but also in different countries in Europe. My sense is COVID will increase that tendency. It's gonna allow these governments to actually say, like, see, we're right. These free movement of people is wrong, or it's a problem. And those governments also use those influx of people to securitize their environment. So the interesting part about right-wing populist movement is that they characterize these aliens or these non-native as a security threat. With COVID, that's a perfect storm to kind of say, like, well, look, we've told you that, like, influx of immigrant is a problem not only for the national fabric or for our cultural values, but also for our healthcare. So it gives like a third dimension to kind of frame that narrative of we have to maintain a strict immigration policy.
No.
Left-wing populist government for themselves don't have that nativist part, but have that anti-globalization part. And if you really look online, you're starting to see a lot of people saying like, this is what happens with globalization. This is what happened in a capitalist environment where we outsource supply chain and where we are less reliant on our own national production. And even in Canada, I'm seeing like in Quebec or in different kinds of blogs, people making the argument that we have to close down and limit trade and have more protectionist policies. So we'll see both, right? We'll see both an attempt to use COVID to limit immigration and use COVID as a way to limit international trade and promote more protectionist nationalist economic policies.
Wow, fascinating. So this is like the internal response. And we've seen as well countries using COVID to further their external or geopolitical interests. And I'm thinking about Russia has been deeply involved in spreading disinformation about COVID. The School of Public Policy published a short paper yesterday on Russian disinformation and COVID. And perhaps some other countries are engaged in that as well. So countries using COVID to further geopolitical aims. Can you tell us about that briefly before we move on to the audience questions?
Sure. This is interesting. I mean, this was a trend that we saw before. Like the Russian and the Chinese, and to be honest, a lot of countries have been really ramping up their capacity to use social media to challenge what in the military they call like cognitive sovereignty, like our capacity as a government or as a people to make our own minds about policy issues. And we've seen, and we have the indication that the Chinese are using this to their own end. They're trying to sow disinformation. Remember, at one point at the beginning of the crisis, there was an argument about how it was a Canadian company who had created COVID and had exported it to China. That actually came from Quebec and was piggybacked by Chinese accounts, and then essentially moved toward this. So there's a willingness for these countries to kind of push back on the criticism. You see this in the US too, right? Like the president of the United States kind of saying like, this is a disease that comes from the exterior. It's a problem, and kind of deflect criticism of the US incapacity to kind of prepare for this crisis. And the Russians also have been using this as a way to kind of bludgeon and move its pieces across the world and kind of use the crisis to delegitimize the US and also the West. For Western democracies, this has been a problem. This is a problem. COVID will, give governments a willingness to implement more and more restrictive policies, to use facial recognitions, to track down people. And there hasn't been a conversation right now on kind of how can we find a balance between the health crisis and also how do we keep staying Canadians and as we come out of this crisis, stay who we are and the values we have. If we close down parks, we close down, like our capacity to move around and have like free discussions online, then that's going to be a major problem culturally and for our societies.
Well, thanks for that. And we have several questions here that focus on the US, on China, and on Russia. So I'll try to package them together a little bit. I think one we can answer rather quickly is whether or not you see the Canada-US border being more restrictive. Do you see them tightening up even more in the future as the US COVID cases just skyrocket over the next few weeks, maybe months?
Canada's like most of Canadian foreign policy has always been to try to keep that border open for all sorts of reasons, and for sure it will become more and more difficult. The Trump administration has been floating the idea of putting troops on the border, making claims about like Canada dumping steel and those kinds of things, as if that was the major problem. And every now and then, there's always this wild claim about how Canada is an actual security problem for the US. And that goes back till the 1930s, where Canada had said at one point, like, we will make sure that it will never be a security problem for the US, and we'll defend ourselves, and we'll make sure that to keep this open. For sure, COVID adds an extra layer of complications and difficulty, and to be honest, the government of Canada will now have to kind of redirect a lot of its attention, a lot of its effort, and a lot of its manpower to convince the Americans to find a way to collaborate and cooperate and to maintain that border open. With a US administration that is going into an election where, if ever there is some significant economic problems, will have a tendency to fall back and kind of protect its jobs, and will probably be less willing to accommodate Canadians. And that's a problem. We hope for the signing of the trade agreement with the Americans that we could actually move away from kind of devoting all our attention to our US relation, and kind of, start to re-increase our relationship with Europe, with Africa, even with Asia. But now with COVID, we'll have to redirect our attention to the US and make sure that this frontier, this border stays open. And it's going to be really complicated for us, especially if we start to see contamination from Canadian sources. If we open up the border and then Canadians go back to Florida or California and then reinfect, pockets across the US, then there's going to be a willingness from the United States to kind of say, like, look, we have to kind of keep this together. So that's going to be really a challenge. Somehow I think the path forward is for the Canadians and Americans to kind of have like a kind of, North American strategy on how to maintain and control COVID, and maybe treat this as a continent problem more so than a country problem. And I'm not exactly sure how they could be doing this, but that's the kind of conversation they should have.
Okay, so I want to thank all the listeners here, because the questions are outstanding, and I'm going to try to package them. And I apologize in advance if I don't get to your specific question, but we do have less than 10 minutes here. So a couple of them focus on a Canada-China relationship. There are reports now that China may not have been quite transparent early on in the COVID situation, and so in light of the conflict that we have with China right now, with the two Michaels being imprisoned there, is it in our best interest to maybe work with the US and other allies in demanding that China be more transparent? And also, how do we fix this global supply chain that seems to have a lot of its anchors in China, right? A lot of masks and gloves and so forth. So how does that Canada-China relationship evolve in the near future?
That's a tough question. My sense is that we've known for a long time that China was never super forthcoming on the kind of this data. And it's not just COVID. We had the same problem with SARS and all these other kinds of H1N1, and we always had this problem. Tagged to this issue was the fact that China seems to have like an uncanny control over the WHO. We've seen, for example, like journalists asking the WHO representative about like Taiwan, and essentially the WHO closing down and being unwilling to pull back and push back on the Chinese. So it seems like the Chinese have been able to co-opt a little bit that health organization, which creates a major problem for Canadians if we're going to rely on these international organizations to be the front line of our global health response. Then if they are co-opted by some countries, that becomes a problem of legitimacy, or like, should we believe the WHO? Should we fund it? Like, how can we believe this? For Canada, in the grand scheme of things, we're really we're gonna have to deal with the issues, and it's not at all clear that we can actually drive these relationship. I think our COVID will bring us toward, we have to focus on the Americans, and in the grand scheme of things, the Americans will drive this pressure to bring back production in the US, bring back production to a safer environment, and in the grand scheme of things, kind of close off or protect itself from the Chinese. So in this case, we probably just are in the boat and we don't have a paddle to actually do anything, so we'll just kind of like follow the water and let the Americans paddle left and right, and make sure that we stay in the boat and tell the Americans where we hope to go, and hopefully they're going to paddle all the way. But I don't think we have a capacity to drive that relationship, and that has become a problem.
Okay, I'm going to try to package a few more questions together because they're still coming in and they're excellent. So we have a few questions dealing with sort of the national security implications of COVID and how that might change our culture. So for example, one of them is on internet security and all this fake news out there promoting a tighter restriction on the internet, and another one on the impact of COVID on national security organizations and agencies. Will COVID be sort of another 9/11 and prompt changes in how countries prepare for and manage these kinds of disasters?
All right, so that's a good question. My sense is that it's going to be extremely difficult to manage our information environment, mostly because most of our online interaction are actually handled through private companies, which are American. And the US has not been willing yet, and to be honest, I don't see it coming, to regulate these companies, and kind of like they would prefer these companies to self-regulate themselves and kind of make this happen. In this case, for Canadians, managing this has become a problem, and trying to close off this environment is extremely difficult. When we track down, and one part of my research is tracking down and collecting tweets and kind of mapping out the global relationship. And what we're seeing right now is that even countries who are trying to save private data or kind of put in place regulations for this, they're extremely reliant and dependent on external actors. And the only countries who are able to actually control their information environment are those like the Chinese, who have like really put up like firewalls and are extremely restrictive. I don't see Western companies or to be honest, Western societies agreeing to these kinds of things. And there's also like an argument there in the literature where, if we start to put in place these regulations, in what respect we will, jugulate or limit innovation, right? There's an argument like in the literature where the Chinese are extremely good at collecting these data and creating these algorithms and these AI systems that are a lot more responsive and a lot better than the ones we have in the Western environment, not because the algorithms are different, because they're all the same, but mostly because they rely on data that is readily available in China and we don't have it. So this willingness to kind of close off facial recognition and those use of technology will maybe put us behind in a global confrontation on AI and automation, which we might not want to have. And to be honest, governments and in Canada, to be honest, there hasn't been that willingness to actually have this conversation. There's no policy right now in Canada on what to do with information warfare. So although the security and intelligence agencies and to be honest, the DND are tracking these and are aware of those, and they know the actors, and they actually are trying to find ways to respond to this, there's no willingness from politicians to actually put in place safeguards or rule of engagement, say like, this isn't okay, this is not okay, and we're going to allow you to do these kinds of operations inside our border. And this is a problem that was there before, and COVID probably will just push this. I don't see this as a watershed moment where it's going to change everything.
Okay. And we just have a few more minutes, and I'm going to ask one last questions before the conclusion. And again, thank you to all our viewers and listeners for your excellent questions. A lot of them pertain to your point earlier about this pandemic, maybe encouraging some countries to be more protectionistic and look inwards. So, Canada being a trading nation is highly dependent on, how open countries are to imports or to our exports. So do you see Canada having a role in trade promotion, or having a small group of allies with which it can keep these open and managed trade deals? How do you see the future of trade if countries become more protectionist?
Difficult. I mean, everybody that does international trade law knows that, even though you sign all these free trade agreements, one of the ways countries have a tendency to protect their environment or to protect their industry is by putting in place health, regulations, right? We want you to do like this kind of hormone, or we want you to do this. COVID will just increase this by 25, and will now give these countries and us and advocates for protectionism like another bullet to say, like, look, like if we don't control these, like yesterday was COVID, but tomorrow it's going to be something else, and after that it's going to be on beef and chicken, and my sense is all these free trade agreements will start to become challenged a lot with those kinds of things. And the problem is that right now the WTO, the World Trade Organization, was always there to kind of like push back on these kind of health regulations and kind of protect trade. The Americans in the last couple of years under the Trump administration have not been willing to help the WTO. They've been actually super critical of it, even not putting new judges in place to adjudicate cases. So we have an international organization that now is less and less capable of adjudicating trade disputes, and that's going to be a problem for us. That's why I think right now, like, one of the way out of this for us is to make sure that at least with the Americans we have a kind of unified like regime of health sanitation regulations that allows us to kind of say, like, what is in Canada and what is in the US is actually the same thing, and follows the same regulation, so that we can actually maintain those kinds of links. But I can see countries and governments use now COVID as a way to kind of increase and put extra measures to essentially make trade more and more difficult.
Well, hopefully we can find a way to manage, and we've now reached our allotted time. And I want to thank you, Professor Boucher, for providing your insights today. And thanks for our audience for joining us and for your excellent questions. The School of Public Policy will be hosting regular webinars on a variety of topics, so please keep an eye on our website under the events tab to sign up as they get confirmed. And I would like to give you a sneak peek on the one being held on Tuesday, April 7th, which is focused on the barriers and benefits to facilitating licensing for immigrant medical professionals in the provinces and here in Canada to help fight COVID. So a very, very timely topic. So please join us next Tuesday on this next webinar. So once again, thank you, Professor Boucher. Thank you for our listeners and our viewers. And thank you to the School of Public Policy events team for putting these together. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.